Walk into any room and watch carefully. Before a single intelligent idea is spoken, before credentials are mentioned, before introductions are even finished, something invisible has already happened. The room has ranked everyone, not consciously, not maliciously, but instinctively. Human beings are constantly scanning for stability, for confidence, for signals of hierarchy. And most people lower their status within the first few minutes without realizing it. They talk too quickly. They laugh too eagerly. They over-explain simple points. They interrupt to prove relevance. They reach for their phones mid-conversation. They lean forward with nervous energy, trying to insert themselves into the flow. None of these behaviors are evil. None are dramatic. But together they communicate something subtle: insecurity. And insecurity is read faster than words. Status is not about dominance. It is not about wealth, volume, or arrogance. It is about perceived self-possession. The room does not measure how smart you are first. It measures how grounded you are. If you appear reactive, you seem lower. If you appear rushed, you seem uncertain. If you appear eager for validation, you seem dependent. And dependence quietly reduces authority. Most people think raising status requires saying impressive things. In reality, it often requires doing fewer things. Because the fastest way to look powerful is to look unbothered, calm, measured, comfortable with space. Watch what happens when someone new enters a conversation. The one who starts speaking immediately is rarely the most respected. The one who observes first, listens fully, and only then contributes, tends to shift the energy. Why? Because restraint signals confidence, and confidence signals value. The tragedy is that many intelligent people sabotage themselves by trying too hard to be seen as intelligent. They fill silence because they assume silence equals weakness. They explain their jokes because they fear being misunderstood. They soften their opinions because they fear tension. But every extra word, every nervous adjustment, every unnecessary clarification chips away at perceived stability. The room reads tempo. It reads posture. It reads whether your presence feels anchored or searching. And once that first impression is formed, everything you say afterward is filtered through it. The Stoics understood something critical about human interaction control. What is yours? Your voice, your pace, your reactions. You cannot control how others evaluate you, but you can control the signals you emit. If your internal state is scattered, your external signals will reflect it. If your internal state is steady, your external presence becomes heavier. Not loud, not aggressive, just grounded. And grounded people are difficult to ignore. This is why status is less about social tricks and more about discipline. You do not raise your status by demanding attention. You raise it by demonstrating that you do not need it. The room is always asking one silent question: is this person stable? The answer is revealed, not in grand gestures, but in small behaviors. Over the next several segments, you will learn 7 quiet behaviors that recalibrate how any room perceives you. None of them require domination. None require performance. They require awareness and control. And once you practice them consistently, something shifts. Conversations slow down around you. Interruptions decrease. People listen more closely, not because you asked them to, but because you signaled that your presence carries weight. And weight in any room commands respect. Before we move into the specific behaviors, you need to understand the deeper mechanism behind status, because without that foundation, every tactic becomes shallow performance. Status is not created by forcing attention. It is created by demonstrating internal stability. The Stoics would not have used the word status the way we do today, but they understood the principle behind it. A person who governs themselves well naturally commands a different kind of presence. Epictetus divided the world into 2 categories: what is within your control and what is not. Other people's opinions fall firmly outside your control. Yet, most people build their behavior around trying to influence those opinions directly. They adjust tone to gain approval. They overcompensate to avoid criticism. They soften their stance to prevent rejection. In doing so, they give the room authority over their emotional state, and the room feels that dependency instantly. When your confidence fluctuates based on how others respond to you, your status fluctuates with it. Stability cannot exist in that environment. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that he had power over his mind, not over external reactions. That principle applies directly to social presence. If you enter a room needing validation, you will behave differently than if you enter a room grounded in self-sufficiency. The need may be subtle, but it leaks through micro-behaviors: speaking too soon, smiling too quickly, agreeing too often, explaining too much. Each one communicates that you are seeking alignment rather than standing in it. True status is perceived when someone appears emotionally self-contained, not closed off, not arrogant, but internally regulated. The room unconsciously trusts people who do not seem desperate for influence. Think about how you perceive someone who laughs at every joke, nods at every opinion, and constantly checks for reactions after speaking. Even if they are intelligent, something feels unsettled. Now compare that to someone who listens fully, speaks deliberately, and remains unaffected by minor social shifts. The second person feels anchored, and anchoring is interpreted as authority. The paradox is simple: the less you try to control the room's perception of you, the more consistent that perception becomes. Because consistency comes from inner alignment, not outer adjustment. When you stop monitoring every reaction to your words, you speak more clearly. When you stop trying to impress, you become more concise. When you stop chasing approval, you appear more selective. Selectivity increases perceived value. This is why chasing attention lowers status. Attention-seeking behavior signals scarcity. It implies that you need acknowledgement to feel secure. And people instinctively assign lower rank to what appears needy. On the other hand, when you demonstrate that your self-worth is not dependent on the room, something subtle shifts. You do not rush to fill silence. You do not rush to agree for comfort. You do not rush to defend minor misunderstandings. That restraint communicates self-governance, and self-governance is the backbone of respect. The behaviors you are about to learn are not tricks to manipulate perception. They are external expressions of internal discipline. If you cultivate the internal state first, the behaviors become natural. If you skip the foundation, they become awkward performance. Remember this as we continue. Status is not about being above others. It is about being firmly rooted within yourself. And when you are rooted, the room adjusts. The first quiet behavior that instantly raises your status in any room is this: speak last, not first. Most people feel an unconscious pressure to contribute immediately. The moment a topic is introduced, they rush to insert their opinion, add their experience, or demonstrate their knowledge. They mistake speed for confidence, but speed often signals anxiety. When you speak too quickly, it communicates that you are eager to secure your place in the conversation. And eagerness, especially in social hierarchies, can look like insecurity. The person who speaks first exposes their position without gathering information. The person who speaks last has gathered the room. Observation is leverage. When you allow others to speak first, you learn who is confident, who is insecure, who dominates, who hesitates, who exaggerates, and who listens. You begin to understand the social landscape before stepping into it. That awareness allows you to respond strategically instead of impulsively. In meetings, the highest status individual often listens longer than anyone else. They are not silent because they lack ideas. They are silent because they are calibrating. They are absorbing context. They are identifying patterns. Then, when they speak, their contribution feels measured and conclusive rather than reactive. Speaking last shifts perception in two ways. First, it positions you as thoughtful. Deliberation signals depth. Second, it gives your words weight. When others have already filled the air with commentary, brevity stands out. A concise observation delivered after the noise settles often lands stronger than a long explanation delivered at the beginning. Silence before speech builds anticipation. Anticipation builds gravity. The Stoics valued restraint in speech as a form of discipline. They believed words should serve purpose, not ego. When you speak last, you reduce the chance of talking from ego. You are less likely to interrupt, less likely to compete for validation, less likely to react emotionally to what someone just said. Instead, you contribute from a position of clarity. There is also a psychological effect at play. When you speak early, you lock yourself into a visible stance. Others then respond to you. When you speak later, you have the advantage of shaping the closing tone. People tend to remember the final statement more vividly than the initial ones. By choosing your moment carefully, you influence how the conversation concludes rather than how it begins. This does not mean you remain silent indefinitely. It means you resist the impulse to prove yourself prematurely. If you have something valuable to add, it will still be valuable after a few moments of listening. If it loses value because you waited, it likely was not as strong as you believed. Practicing this behavior requires patience. You will feel the urge to jump in. You may fear being overlooked. Let that discomfort exist without reacting to it. Over time, you will notice something subtle. People begin to look toward you before you speak. They begin to anticipate your input because you have trained them to associate your voice with intention rather than impulse. And that anticipation elevates your status naturally. Speak with purpose, speak with timing, and when possible, speak last. The second quiet behavior that instantly raises your status in any room is this: slow your movements. Most people broadcast their internal state through unnecessary motion. They adjust their clothing repeatedly, tap their fingers, shift their weight from side to side, glance around the room too quickly, nod excessively, while others speak or reach for their phone the moment there is a pause. None of these gestures are dramatic, but together they signal nervous energy. And nervous energy lowers perceived authority. When your movements are rushed, your presence feels unsettled. When your gestures are excessive, your words feel less controlled. The room may not consciously register why, but it will feel the difference. Stillness communicates the opposite. When you move deliberately, when you sit without fidgeting, when you walk at a steady pace instead of rushing, you project composure. Composure is interpreted as confidence because it suggests you are not under internal pressure. Think about individuals who naturally command attention without speaking much. They do not flail their hands. They do not constantly adjust their posture. They do not lean in desperately to be heard. Their movements are economical. Every gesture has intention. That economy creates presence. In contrast, frantic motion creates noise, and noise reduces clarity. Slowing your movements also changes how you experience the room. When you rush physically, your mind follows. When you slow down physically, your breathing steadies, your thoughts organize, your tone stabilizes. This alignment between body and mind creates a cohesive signal. The Stoics understood that the body and mind are connected in discipline. If you cannot govern your physical impulses, you will struggle to govern your emotional ones. Practicing stillness is not about becoming rigid. It is about eliminating unnecessary movement. When someone challenges you, do not immediately lean forward aggressively. When someone interrupts you, do not flinch or react physically. Maintain posture. Maintain eye contact. Let your response come from steadiness, not speed. The difference is subtle but powerful. In professional environments, this behavior becomes even more critical. If you rush to set up your laptop, shuffle papers nervously, or speak while adjusting your position repeatedly, you unintentionally lower the authority of your message. When you take a moment to stand upright, breathe, and begin speaking calmly, you anchor attention. Slowness suggests control of tempo, and control of tempo suggests leadership. There is also psychological leverage in moving slower than the average pace of the room. When others speak quickly, your measured tone stands out. When others gesture wildly, your restraint feels deliberate. You do not mirror chaos. You remain grounded, and grounded individuals shift the emotional temperature of a space. Practice this consciously. Walk slightly slower than you think you should. Sit without fidgeting for longer than feels comfortable. When reaching for something, do it smoothly rather than abruptly. Over time, these micro-adjustments accumulate into a different aura. People begin to describe you as calm, composed, or confident without knowing exactly why. That is because your movements no longer leak uncertainty. They reflect control, and control, even when silent, elevates status. The third quiet behavior that instantly raises your status in any room is this: do not rush to fill silence. Most people are uncomfortable with quiet. The moment a conversation pauses, they feel compelled to repair it. They add another sentence. They clarify what was already clear. They laugh unnecessarily. They ask a filler question just to keep the momentum alive. That impulse reveals something subtle but important. It shows that they are uncomfortable without external stimulation. And discomfort in silence often signals insecurity. Silence is not a void that needs to be repaired. It is space, and space creates gravity. When you allow silence to exist without panicking, you communicate emotional stability. You demonstrate that you are not desperate to maintain attention. You are comfortable letting a moment breathe. That comfort alone elevates your perceived status. Watch what happens in group settings. Someone makes a bold statement. The room goes quiet for a few seconds. Most people immediately rush to soften it or redirect the topic. The person with quiet authority does something different. They let the silence settle. They hold eye contact. They wait. That pause forces others to sit with the statement rather than escape it. It shifts the weight of the conversation. Silence used correctly amplifies impact. There is psychological tension in quiet moments, and whoever is least disturbed by that tension controls it. If you cannot tolerate silence, you will always try to escape it. If you can sit calmly inside it, others will unconsciously adjust to your tempo. The Stoics valued restraint in speech because unnecessary words dilute strength. Epictetus warned that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. When you speak only when necessary, your words carry more density. But when you talk to avoid silence, your words become filler. Filler lowers status because it signals need. In professional environments, this behavior is especially powerful. When you finish making a point, stop. Do not add an extra sentence to reassure the room. Do not over-explain to ensure agreement. Let your statement stand. The silence that follows may feel long to you, but it often feels normal to everyone else. That pause reinforces that you are comfortable with your position. In social settings, this discipline works the same way. If someone tells a joke that falls flat, do not rush to rescue it. If someone says something provocative, do not rush to correct it. Observe. Let the moment unfold. Your calm detachment communicates that you are not emotionally reactive, and non-reactivity commands respect. Practicing this requires awareness. The next time a pause occurs in conversation, resist the urge to speak immediately. Count silently to 3. Notice the discomfort. Let it pass without acting on it. Over time, you will realize that silence is not an enemy. It is a tool. It allows you to slow the room down. It gives your previous words weight. It creates anticipation before your next ones. People lean in when they sense something deliberate, and deliberate pacing elevates status without effort. The room does not respect constant noise. It respects measured presence. When you no longer fear silence, you stop chasing attention. And when you stop chasing attention, attention begins to follow you. The fourth quiet behavior that instantly raises your status in any room is this refuse to compete for attention. Attention is the invisible currency in every social environment. Most people fight for it without realizing they are fighting. They interrupt subtly. They speak louder when someone else begins to dominate. They escalate humor to regain focus. They exaggerate stories to pull eyes back toward themselves. All of it signals the same thing: insecurity about relevance. And insecurity about relevance lowers status immediately. When you compete for attention, you place yourself on the same level as everyone else chasing it. The room subconsciously categorizes you as another participant in the struggle. But when you remove yourself from that competition, something shifts. You become selective rather than reactive. You wait rather than force. You allow others to finish speaking even if you disagree. You do not raise your volume to overpower them. You do not talk over them to prove a point. You let their energy exhaust itself if necessary. That restraint communicates confidence because it suggests you do not need to win the spotlight to maintain presence. In many environments, especially professional ones, people reveal their insecurity by how desperately they try to be noticed. They speak on every topic, even when they add little. They laugh the loudest. They repeat points already made just to have their voice heard. The highest status individual often does the opposite. They contribute selectively. They choose moments of maximum clarity rather than maximum frequency. They are comfortable letting others have the floor. That comfort signals internal security. The Stoics would frame this as mastery over ego. The ego wants recognition. It wants to be seen as important. It reacts when someone else receives more attention. But authority is not threatened by temporary spotlight shifts. Authority understands that value does not disappear simply because someone else is speaking. When you stop competing, you conserve energy. And conserved energy makes your contributions sharper when you decide to use them. There is also a powerful psychological effect at play. The person who does not chase attention appears as if they already possess it. People are drawn toward those who seem indifferent to external validation, not cold, not disengaged, but unconcerned with proving themselves. That indifference creates intrigue, and intrigue elevates perceived status. Practice this deliberately. In your next group conversation, notice when the impulse to interrupt arises. Let it pass. Notice when someone receives praise and your instinct is to redirect the conversation toward your own achievements. Resist it. Notice when humor shifts away from you and you feel the urge to reclaim it. Stay composed. Over time, the room will begin to interpret your restraint as strength, because you have demonstrated that your identity is not dependent on applause. The paradox is consistent. The less you chase attention, the more naturally it gravitates toward you. People begin to ask for your opinion. They pause before speaking over you. They notice when you have been quiet, not because you demanded it, but because your lack of competition elevated your presence above the noise. In any room, the person who is hardest to provoke into performance often holds the highest status. Stop performing. Start governing yourself. The room will adjust accordingly. The fifth and sixth quiet behaviors that instantly raise your status in any room are closely connected. Control your facial expressions and practice strategic brevity. Most people do not realize how much they reveal through their face. A raised eyebrow at the wrong moment, an exaggerated smile to soften tension, a visible eye roll when someone speaks, a quick grimace when challenged. These micro-reactions broadcast your internal state before you have chosen how to respond. And once your emotions are visible on demand, your leverage decreases. High-status individuals do not have blank faces. They have disciplined faces. Their expressions are measured, intentional, and proportionate. When they disagree, their face does not distort with irritation. When they are challenged, their features remain composed. When they are praised, they do not over-celebrate. Emotional moderation in the face signals internal control, and internal control signals authority. Think about how unsettling it can be when someone maintains calm eye contact without flinching while others around them react dramatically. That steadiness communicates that their emotional system is not easily hijacked. In contrast, exaggerated reactions make you predictable. If someone knows exactly how your face will respond to criticism, they know how to manipulate you. But when your expressions are balanced and controlled, you become harder to read, and difficulty in reading you increases perceived depth. The Stoics practiced examining their emotional impressions before granting them outward expression. They understood that not every feeling deserves immediate display. You can feel something strongly without advertising it instantly. That discipline protects your composure. The second half of this behavior is strategic brevity. The more you talk, the more opportunities you create to dilute your message. Long explanations often arise from a desire to be fully understood or fully validated. But excessive explanation signals insecurity. It suggests that you fear your initial statement was not enough. High-status communication is concise, clear, direct. When someone asks you a question, answer it without unnecessary backstory. When someone challenges you, respond without a 5-minute defense. When someone praises you, accept it without deflecting awkwardly or over-qualifying your success. Brevity communicates confidence because it implies you trust your words to stand on their own. There is psychological weight in short sentences delivered calmly. They create finality. They reduce room for misinterpretation. They show that you are not scrambling for approval. In professional settings, brevity is often equated with competence. Leaders rarely ramble. They state direction clearly and move forward. In social settings, brevity prevents you from oversharing or appearing desperate to be understood. Practice this deliberately. The next time you respond to a question, cut your answer in half. Remove filler phrases, eliminate over-explanations, say what is necessary, and stop. At the same time, monitor your facial reactions. Notice when irritation tries to surface. Notice when nervous laughter attempts to escape. Slow your breathing and allow your face to remain composed. Over time, these adjustments will transform how others perceive you. You will appear more stable, more self-assured, more difficult to rattle. And people instinctively respect what is difficult to destabilize. Control your expressions. Control your words. The combination builds presence that speaks before you do. The seventh quiet behavior that instantly raises your status in any room is this: leave first. Not abruptly, not dramatically, not as a performance, but deliberately. Most people overstay. They linger in conversations long after the energy has peaked. They continue talking because they fear disappearing. They wait for a perfect moment to exit and end up staying until the room grows dull or chaotic. And when you overstay, your presence loses value. Scarcity creates impact. Prolonged exposure dilutes it. High-status individuals understand timing. They enter with awareness and they exit with intention. When a discussion reaches its natural conclusion, they do not cling to it. When their contribution has been made, they do not remain to fill empty air. They close conversations cleanly. Good to see you. Let's continue this later. I have to step out. Calm. Simple. No elaborate explanation. That decisiveness communicates autonomy. It shows that your time is structured, that your energy is not endlessly available, that you are not waiting for permission to disengage. There is psychological strength in being the one who leaves first. It subtly shifts the dynamic from dependence to control. The person who hesitates to exit often appears unsure of their social footing. The person who exits comfortably appears self-contained. This is not about arrogance. It is about boundaries. When you can step away without anxiety, you demonstrate that your identity is not anchored to that specific room. You have somewhere else to go, something else to do, an internal world that continues whether the conversation does or not. The Stoics valued detachment from external validation. They understood that clinging to environments out of fear of exclusion weakens character. Leaving at the right time is a small act of detachment. It proves to yourself that you do not need constant reinforcement to feel secure. In professional settings, this behavior is especially powerful. If a meeting has concluded its main objective, summarize briefly and disengage. If a networking conversation has run its course, end it cleanly, rather than waiting awkwardly for momentum to return. People remember the final impression more vividly than the middle. Leaving while your presence still carries weight preserves that impression. Practice this intentionally. The next time you are in a social or professional setting, notice when the energy shifts. Notice when your contribution is complete. Instead of lingering close gracefully and move on, you will feel the difference immediately. There is confidence in controlled departure. There is authority in choosing your exit rather than drifting until dismissed. Over time, this discipline compounds. People begin to associate your presence with clarity and decisiveness. They anticipate your contributions because they know you will not waste them, and they respect your time because you visibly respect it yourself. Enter calmly, contribute deliberately, leave intentionally. When you master your entrance and your exit, your presence carries weight in every room you step into. Now step back and look at what these 7 quiet behaviors actually represent. Speaking last, slowing your movements, allowing silence, refusing to compete for attention, controlling your expressions, practicing brevity, leaving first. None of them are flashy. None require dominance, intimidation, or manipulation. They require something far more rare: self-possession. Status at its highest level is not about being above others. It is about being anchored within yourself. Most people try to raise their status by increasing output: more words, more reactions, more visibility, more performance. But true authority is often revealed through reduction: fewer words, fewer reactions, fewer visible insecurities. The Stoics did not teach social dominance. They taught inner governance, and inner governance naturally translates into external gravity. When your reactions are measured, you appear stable. When your movements are deliberate, you appear grounded. When you tolerate silence, you appear confident. When you do not chase attention, you appear secure. When your expressions are controlled, you appear disciplined. When your speech is concise, you appear clear. When you exit intentionally, you appear autonomous. Together, these behaviors create a presence that feels solid, and solidity commands respect. Think about the most respected individual you have encountered. They likely did not try to dominate the room. They did not over-explain. They did not fidget or compete. They seemed internally steady. That steadiness is what people respond to, because in environments filled with emotional volatility, the calm center becomes magnetic. People trust what feels stable. They listen to what feels grounded. They follow what feels self-directed. The deeper truth is this: the room does not elevate you because you demand it. It elevates you because you demonstrate that you do not need elevation to function. Neediness lowers rank. Independence raises it. And independence begins internally. If your sense of worth depends on applause, your behavior will betray it. If your sense of worth is rooted in character, your behavior will reflect that too. That is why these behaviors are not tricks. They are expressions of discipline. You cannot consistently move slowly if your mind is chaotic. You cannot consistently remain silent if you are desperate for validation. You cannot consistently leave first if you fear exclusion. Each quiet behavior forces you to confront an internal weakness, and strengthening that weakness strengthens your presence. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that reputation is external and fleeting, but character is internal and enduring. When you focus on governing your character, status becomes a byproduct. When you focus on chasing status, character often erodes. Choose carefully which one you pursue. If you practice these disciplines consistently, something subtle will happen. People will interrupt you less. They will listen more carefully. They will hesitate before challenging you carelessly, not because you intimidated them, but because you projected steadiness. And people instinctively respect what is steady. Remember this: above everything, status is not noise. It is gravity. It is the quiet confidence of someone who does not overreact, does not overcompete, does not overexpose, and does not overstay. Govern yourself first. Let the room adjust. When your inner world is ordered, your outer presence carries weight without effort. And that is authority that does not need to announce itself.